So we're just starting the Facebook stream, so you will be able to see this on Facebook as well. And then we'll just get started. I'm just this here. Got some more people coming in the room. We are also on Facebook right now as well. Great. Okay. So I'm just going to share my screen. All right, we'll get started. Welcome, everybody. Oh, I'm in the back of my screen here. Hold on. All right, perfect. Thank you so much to everyone to joining us. Grab this here. We'll just wait one more minute. I think I see someone else joining, so we'll give it just one more minute there. All right, so welcome everyone to the 2020 Fox Cities Book Festival, reimagined virtually. So we're really excited to have you here. My name is Megan, I'm with the Book Festival, and I'm really excited that we were able to reimagine everything and connect you with writers and readers, connect writers and readers online. So thank you so much for being here with us and your continued support. The mission at the Fox Cities Book Festival is to celebrate an engaged community of readers. To engage our communities, we offer our annual program called the Fox Cities Books Festival. So basically it's a full week of events with authors from panels, discussions, workshops, and more throughout the community. And so this year we took it all virtually. And let's see if this will move here. And so the book festival is, right here in support of all of our partners. We're really thankful to have their support and donations and promotions and just kind of keeping us in their mind throughout the year. We couldn't do it without them. Every event is free for the book festival. And so we want to thank all of our supporters and donations here. We always appreciate your continued support. If you think that it's something you would want to be interested in supporting, finding out more information, we can be reached online, foxcitiesbookfestival.org. You also can reach out to us through Facebook or visit your local library. Many of us involved in the book festival are also on the library. So we appreciate your continued support. We're so excited to be here. Without your support, we really wouldn't have a festival. So thank you. Let me grab one more slide here. It's working. All right. So we also do have a code of conduct with our book festival right here. So we just ask everyone to please be kind, and no form of harassment will be attended in any, or will be tolerated in any kind. If anything needs to be, if you see any disrespectful behavior, we will ask you to leave. But we have faith that our community will be follow the code of conduct. But we just wanted to put that out there so everyone's aware. And now we're so excited. We've got a great event here. We've got Jaime Jo Wright with us today. So we're really excited. Please join me in welcoming her, and I will go over and stop sharing my screen here. And if Al goes as well, we can introduce Jaime. Thank you so much. You're on.
Hi. It's been so great to be a part of this, and I'm really honored to be here today. Thank you everyone for joining, and just a little background about myself. If you're not familiar with me, my name is Jaime Jo Wright, and I write historical split time fiction. So basically that means 50% of the book is in present day and 50% is in the historical time period. And it's mystery suspense is what I write. And that's what we're going to talk about today. There are a lot of authors out there that are writing split time. I know some of us love to read it. I personally do. And obviously, I like to write it as well. And so I thought it would be fun to do a little workshop today for those of you who are aspiring to be writers or write. How does an author go about writing a split time novel? And then also for those of you who may be readers and just joining us just out of curiosity, again, how does it all fit together? I'm often asked the question, how do you write your books? What's the order that you write your book in? Do you write the historical timeline as its own story and then write the contemporary and then somehow fit the pieces together? And how do you do that? So I wanted to give a little bit of structure to the process. Again, for those of you who are looking at being writers or those of you who are writers and authors looking at getting into the split time fiction, wanted to give some structure for that and then also allow for readers to see a little bit behind the scenes on how it works. So I am going to share my screen here as well and get to the presentation. All right. Okay, so writing the split time. Split time, just for your information, is also known as dual time, and then it can also be referred to as time slip. So it sort of depends who in the writing community you're talking to, how they term it and how they explain it, but the definition for all three is pretty much the same. And again, that's 50-50, two different time periods, usually two different perspectives of two different people. One thing that I have known is at times people have mistaken time slip or split time for speculative fiction, which is like a fantasy fiction, and it doesn't necessarily mean that it's speculative. Like, for example, the book that I'll be referring to today is the first one that I published, The House on Foster Hill, and that one took place in 1906 and then in present day. Nothing speculative about that, just purely historical setting and present day setting. However, you can sometimes in any genre have a split time story, something that is split between two different time periods. So we're going to put together the pieces on how to create a split time book. There's no distinct correct formula for it. I will say that up front. It's not a one rule fits all. I think everybody who writes split time, whether you are myself or Wendy Webb or Susanna Kearsley or any of those, you're going to be having your own format and how you put it together. So what I'm sharing with you today is my format and how I do my books. And hopefully it'll give you a little bit of guidance as you go forward into your own personal writing or reading experience. So first and foremost, I like to split the concept of creating a split time story into 4 parts. So if you picture a square, as you'll see with the book cover right here, The House on Foster Hill, this was the first book that I wrote. It's a square, and there's 4 parts to a square if you split that with a line down the middle and a line across. And each part has an active role in how the plot, how the book, how the story is created. The first one is defining your theme. So when I look at a story and I'm starting to write a split time story, I'm starting to write a plot in my head, I'm comprising an idea in my mind, I need to define a theme for it. And for me, that's really important because it is the foundation on which my entire novel is based. The theme is what's going to tie the characters, the mystery or the romance, whatever the genre is, it's going to tie that together in a common thread. This is not to be mistaken for a plot. A plot is the story. A plot is what's thrusting the story forward. The plot could be a romance between 2 people. It could be a mystery that needs to be solved. It could be a crime scene that needs to be identified. It could be just general fiction as far as, maybe a woman's journey through breast cancer. Whatever the story plot is, that is different from what I'm saying is a theme. A theme is something that is going to ground that story. So what is the point that you want to get across in the story that you are telling? This is something I don't think all stories necessarily have, but I think even if you don't define it for the reader, you as a writer will find your story far more easier to write if you have an underlying theme. When I say theme, I'm looking at usually a one word, something that's going to really give your novel, your story focus. So for example, when I wrote The House on Foster Hill, a brief synopsis of it is, in present day time, a young woman, her name is Kane, moves from California to Wisconsin. She's purchased an old house, sight unseen, in the hometown of her great-grandmother, Ivy. When she arrives, she finds the house is not everything that it's said to be, and it also has a very mysterious history attached to it. And the further she goes into the story of the house, the more danger begins to arise, the more secrets are found within the walls of the house, and the more she finds out about her great-grandmother's life. She finds out that back in 1906, there was a murder at the house on Foster Hill, and a young woman's body was found. And to this day, which would be present day, nobody has ever identified who this young woman was. And that's the mystery that catapults Kane into searching into the history of the house on Foster Hill. Now, on the flip side of that story is the historical side, and that's coming from her great-grandmother's point of view, which is Ivy. Ivy is the young woman who discovers the dead body at the house on Foster Hill. She discovers the young, nameless, unidentified body. She dubs the body Gabriella, so it has a name. And her sole purpose in this book is to give Gabriella a history. She wants to uncover who she was, find out what Gabriella was doing at Foster Hill House, who killed her, and what the premise was for the entire story around Gabriella's life. That is what Ivy's looking for. Now that's a plot, and that's a brief synopsis of the story, but is that the theme? The theme is something completely different. When I looked at that story, knowing the underlying backstory, I understood that basically I lined up my three characters, I have Kane in present day, I have Ivy in the past, and I have Gabriella, who's the murder victim. There was one theme that links them together. And that theme was all three women were looking for hope. They were looking for a reason to continue to exist, a reason to live, a reason to have purpose in the life that they led. So hope became that key word, that everything that I wrote with The House on Foster Hill wanted to stand on the foundation of that journey to finding hope, something that I think we all can relate to, and wanting to have something to look forward to and a purpose. So defining your theme of your story is critical because everything else is going to be shaped and framed around that one word, whether that's hope, whether that's identity, whether that's grace, whatever the word may be, that's going to be your theme. We'll get into that a little bit later, so I'll keep moving on. But that would be square number one, or part number one of the square. Part number two is defining your setting. So settings in a split time novel are very, very important. I think arguably settings in any novel are important. You definitely want a setting that's going to intrigue a reader and intrigue you as the writer. But along with that, you want to define a setting so that it's unique and it's distinct, and it's also complementary with the setting in the other time period. So for example, in The House on Foster Hill, there is the house on Foster Hill. That technically is the setting. So then as I look at that setting, I need to figure out what will make it distinct from each other in the two different time periods. So I have 1906, but I also have present day. As I'm taking the reader on a journey, I want to make sure that they're not getting confused and wondering which time period that they're in. I need to make things distinct enough between both settings so that when I flip from one setting to another setting, one time period to another time period, it's not jarring for the reader and they're not confused and wondering what's going on. So we'll talk a little bit more about settings, but this is something that's really going to potentially also support that underlying theme. How does the setting in this scenario support the theme of hope? And you wouldn't necessarily think that a house, a solitary object, really does much for that theme of hope. But in reality, if you look at the setting as another character in your novel, that will breathe life into your novel, and it will also breathe life into the story, because the house on Foster Hill will then become a character and not so much just a platform for which a story is told. So as I looked at the house on Foster Hill, I started thinking about different ways that I could create it to be distinct in both eras and also support the theme of hope. Because if you look at the house in 1906, the house was occupied. The house had mystery surrounded by it. The house already had a story and a legacy to it, but it wasn't necessarily dilapidated, falling apart, and in a pit of failure, in essence. In present day, the house on Foster Hill was falling apart. It was abandoned. It was dilapidated, and it was surrounded almost by a cursed mystery, something that kept people from wanting to come near it, and even rumors of ghosts and things like that were a part of it. So as I looked at that with the concept of the word hope, really what the house on Foster Hill did in present day was showed the shell of what we often are as a human without hope. Something that is empty, something that has no purpose, something that really could be torn down. And in 1906, the house on Foster Hill was already showing that almost premonition of becoming hopeless. There was things that were affecting its life, things that were affecting the house, things that were taking place there that were not healthy, that were not hopeful. And so between those two settings, it showed the slow progression of what would happen as a parallel illustration to a human life that slowly goes without hope, and it slowly starts to feel abandoned. So defining your theme is very important. One, so that it is distinct for the readers, but two, it also supports that underlying theme and creates an illustration in words and in visual picture that supports that underlying story. Number three, which would be your next square, would be identifying and defining your characters. With a split time story, you're going to have a minimum of 2 unique characters. So in other words, you're going to have one point of view in the present day. You're going to have one point of view in the past. Now, you may have more points of views. Originally, when I wrote The House on Foster Hill, I had 4 point of views. I had 4 main characters. We did diminish that to 2 because it was simply easier for a reader to follow. And so I would say, you can look at your characters and how many you're going to put in your book. There's not, again, a general rule for it, but the question would be how well can your readers follow that many characters and that many points of view? When you're looking at defining your characters, not only will you have one unique one for each setting, but you're also going to want to make sure that they're starkly different, but yet they have things in common. In other words, can these 2 characters get along in the real life if they were to walk side by side? But also, could you tell them apart if they were to walk side by side? And that's the critical part with a split time story, is you need to have characters that are unique and that are distinct, but that also complement each other. The reason they need to complement each other is because your reader is going to draw an invisible line between both characters, because the story, even though it's split time and it's taking part in 2 different time periods, your story is still going to link those 2 characters together somehow in some way. And so because they're linked, the reader is going to need in their brain and in their psyche an ability to see them as complementary. Otherwise, it's going to create friction, it's going to create tension, and overall, not a lot of harmony for the story in and of itself. So as you look at your characters, again, that's what you're going to want to do, is really work on making them different, but having commonalities. And again, we're going to dig into this a little bit deeper as we go. And then your fourth corner is defining your plot. Again, the plot is different from the theme. Again, the theme is that one word that your entire story, setting, character, and plot will revolve around. At this point, your plot is what's going to carry the story from time to time. The plot is going to be like your characters. You're going to want it to be distinctive, but you're also going to want it to have threads of commonality. It really wouldn't make sense if you had 2 completely different stories sandwiched in one book between two book covers and expect them to work. They need to have links. They need to have things that tie them together, that create a commonality and create a friendship between the 2 stories. And at the same time, they need to be distinct enough where a reader isn't, 1, getting confused, and 2, wants to read both of them. And then also with that, with your plot, you're going to want to continue to go back to that central theme. Does your plot further the theme? Does the plot of Foster Hill further the theme of hope? So those are some of the questions that you'll want to ask yourself. So that's a broad view of how I split up a novel into 4 parts, and I look at forming that into creating a split time novel. Let's dig in a little bit deeper. Okay, so as we define our theme, there's 3 parts to a theme, and let's look at each one of those a little bit deeper. First of all, conceptually. Conceptually, the theme is going to be a layered story that's going to require a bold or a conceptual theme. Preferably, we're going to narrow this down to 1 word, and this is what I mentioned before. That's going to encompass the basis of all the story elements, and that can all be tied back to this 1 word. So the books that I've written, Foster Hill, The House on Foster Hill, that word was hope. The Reckoning at Gossamer Pond, that word was grace. Curse of Misty Wayfair, it was identity, healing, and then my most recent release, the Haunting at Bonaventure Circus, was about being seen. But you can also look at this in other books. So if you look at the book of Great Expectations by Dickens, you're going to see a theme of rich versus poor, belonging. You're going to see a theme of stewardship and how to treat other people when you have wealth, and what does that do for the characters. If you look at another novel, I'm trying to think of Where the Crawdads Sing, that was recently released. You know, that book really is a theme of belonging as well, and also of identity and who you are and what creates your identity, and how far will you go to preserve your identity and your independence. Those are very key parts to the stories when you look at Great Expectations and you look at Where the Crawdads Sing. They have very elemental, foundational thrusts in that book that will push to support that conceptual theme. That 1 word, that 1 idea, all of it circles back to it. If you have that point of reference, your story will take on a lot of depth that a plot alone cannot give. Some stories are told strictly with plot, and strictly with plot is often just having a story. It's boy meets girl. It's so-and-so was murdered. How do we solve it? It's so-and-so has, cancer. What was their journey? And you look at those situations, and those are good stories. But if you add a conceptual theme to it, you've now given it a layer of depth that it may not normally have, because everything can become an illustration. In a sense, it's like poetry. As you're writing poetry, and you read, Edgar Allan Poe, or you read, I'm always a Poe fan, so he's always the first one I think of, but you read Robert Frost, etc. You're going to read word pictures and lyrical ways of explaining and creating visual pictures of a theme, of a concept, of something that they're wanting to portray. That's why we take poetry and we dig into it, we analyze it, we dissect it. We want to understand not just what was the poem saying, but what was the poem meaning? What was the story inside of the story? And that's really what I'm getting at when I'm talking about having a conceptual theme. We really want to break it down so we have that story within the story, that ultimate thrust, that deeper part that we're trying to communicate to our readers. And so much of that will create a depth that everything else will start circling around and create a magnet that holds it together. As we're looking at theme, we also want to take the conceptual theme into consideration, and then we want to break it down into physical themes for our characters. So let's take this a little bit further. Now we have a conceptual theme. We have the theme of hope, and we'll use that for the illustration going through this. The House on Foster Hill, the theme was hope. We then needed to break that down into physical themes for our characters, because both characters were going to be working on hope, but what did that mean to them individually? All right, this was going to bring commonality between my 2 leads, but also allow them to have very different personalities and very different stories. So in The House on Foster Hill, my primary character in my present day story moved to a new town after her husband was murdered. So right there, it's a very short synopsis of her life. There was a lot more going on, but when you look at that concept right there, you can see all sorts of threads of needing to find hope. She's moving. She's been pulled from her roots in California. She's come to a new town. She's grieving. She's trying to answer the questions around her own husband's murder, her own husband's death. There's a lot of fluctuation in her life right now. Not much is stable, and she's trying to find hope in all of that. Couple that with the past story, we have Ivy. Ivy's found a murder victim. There's a lot of desperation in that. There's a lot of PTSD that could potentially erupt from that. I mean, finding a murder victim is not necessarily a calm walk in the park on a Sunday afternoon. And so she's looking to find A, what was the point of this? B, this is a young woman who's barely over the cusp of being a girl. Where's the point in the cutting short of such a life? And then Ivy herself has her own personal history with death that has really granted her a fascination to preserve the stories of the people that have gone on before, to make them remembered, to not let them be lost to the annals of time. And there's nothing worse than finding a victim who's been murdered and has no identity, has no one to remember them, has no purpose and no meaning in life because their life is unknown. So you see that conceptual thought of hope has now migrated and expanded into a physical theme for each of my characters. They're both looking for hope, but now we've gotten a little bit more definition as to what is that journey toward that theme for each character. For Kane, it's reconciling with her husband's murder. For Ivy, it's reconciling with the unknown body of a murder victim. And then the next third part to a theme is the mental theme. The mental theme is important to complement and support the conceptual theme. The lead characters should be processing mental and emotional struggles that coincide. So in The House on Foster Hill, we have Kane, who's the primary present day, and her underlying conceptual is hope. She's trying to find hope under her physical theme, which is moving to a new town and reconciling her husband's murder. And now her mental struggle, her mental story, so to say, is fostering the grief for the loss of that husband and a lack of vision, a lack of goal for her life. She's moved, she's adopted this abandoned house with this horrible history, and she really doesn't have much of a vision or a goal for her life. And so she's going to go through a lot of mental and emotional struggles, and we need to define as an author what those mental and emotional struggles are, how they relate to her physical theme, and how they eventually tie back into that conceptual theme. And the same thing goes for Ivy in the past. She's fostering grief for the loss of a brother that she lost, and she has an intense focus on preserving the memories of those who've died. So everything that Ivy sees, experiences, says, and does in her story are going to go through the filter of her mental and emotional lens, which is grief and this need to preserve memories, preserve life, because what hope is there in life if you're not remembered in death? All right. Then as we move on to the setting, when you're having two different time periods, you're also, again, going to want to make these very, very distinct and unique. So picking a unique setting is going to help set your novel apart. Rather than having two fictionalized locations that aren't distinctive, let's identify what makes them set apart. And in the past, much of this setting can be defined by history. So for example, in some of the books that I've written, the house on Foster Hill was an abandoned house. And as I exampled earlier, that abandoned house also represented the theme of hope. In my next book, it was a big tent revival. In the Curse of Misty Wayfarer, it was an insane asylum. In Echoes Among the Stones, it was an ammunition plant. And in Bonaventure Circus, it was a circus and it was a train depot. Each one of these settings were historically placed based on historical happenings, historical events. So the Big Tent Revival was based around some Midwest history here in southern Wisconsin. The Insane Asylum was circled around an insane asylum in northern Michigan, northern Wisconsin. The ammunition plant was by the Badger Ordnance Plant in Sauk City, Wisconsin. And Bonaventure Circus was around Circus Rodriguez Museum and the Ringling Brothers Circus. So a lot of historical influences in choosing these locations and in choosing these settings. And then again, these settings all reflected the theme of their books. So for example, if you looked at The Curse of Misty Wayfair, that's an insane asylum. The theme of that book was identity. And so an insane asylum is a great place to wonder what your identity is and to wonder who you are as a person and what is your value to community and your value to life and your value to the people around you. So you're going to want to pick a unique setting for your historical period that will really grab the attention of a reader and really make that interesting to them. So look for something that's unique if you're dealing with a historical setting, something that isn't necessarily common. One could argue an abandoned house is relatively common. I think there's a lot of books out there with creepy abandoned houses, but there's one reason there's a lot of books out there with creepy abandoned houses, and that's because it's a popular concept. So sometimes you can use a trope to your advantage, and you can use what people are already interested in and create a story around that. Now, when you move into the present part of your story, you're going to be looking at a complementary location. It's either going to be the same location as the historical one, but just set in present day, or it's going to be another location that complements the past. So let's look at an example of that. In the house on Foster Hill, which was the one that I wrote, it's both the abandoned house. So what I did with both of those was I made the abandoned house, the house on Foster Hill, look different. In the past, it was less neglected, less abandoned, more interactive. In the present, it was very abandoned, it was very dilapidated, and it was very much avoided. And so there were some very stark differences between it that made it the same location, but different. And you're going to want to make sure that you identify how your location is different in both time periods if you're working with the same location. On the flip side, what might be easier is if you're writing a split time story with past and present, is to use locations that complement each other but are different. So you don't have to focus so much on how to creatively make the same place different. So an example of that could be you could write a historical story around, Leonardo da Vinci and a painter's studio, and maybe he has an apprentice that he's teaching how to paint in Italy, and they're working in the studio. And then you could flip to the present day story where you have a curator in an art museum. And so those stories, those locations complement each other. We have art in both of them, but yet they're very starkly different. One's a studio, one's a museum, one's very aptly set back in the era of the golden age of artists, and one is very clearly set in the era of the days where we appreciate the golden day of the artists. So again, between the past and the present, you're going to want to make sure there's distinctions and there's similarities. And in the end, the third point here is you want the two settings to mirror each other. In other words, a good way to summarize what I've been talking about is, if you looked into one, would you see glimpses of the reflection of the other? So if they're not exactly mirror images, like the house on Foster Hill, where they're both the same place, then they need to be ones that make sense in the mirror, like the art museum and the painter's studio. Can you step into a mirror and enter a world that furthers the one that you just left? That's where you're going to want to be really careful with your settings, that you are picking something that's complementary. Otherwise, it could potentially be jarring and or worse off, confusing for the reader. All right. Characters, past and present. This one only has 2 points under characters because you're really dealing with past and present. So as you're building your characters, again, never forget that you're wanting to still focus around that central theme. But again, you're going to want to make sure they're similarly to settings distinct from each other. Your past character should have distinctions that make them clearly historical. So in the house on Foster Hill, I needed to do research on turn of the century, the clothing that they wore, the language that they used, slang that they used, how they composed sentence structures. They compose sentence structures very differently than they do nowadays in English, even in common spoken English. And so I needed to look at those things because that is part of what would set the historical side character, Ivy, apart from the present day character, Kane. It helps differentiate themselves, and it also helps the reader understand a little bit more of that historical side. It gives them a flavor and a taste, like they've stepped back into a time machine and they've gone backward into time, and now they're walking the streets of 1906 small town America. They're standing at the base of a hill looking up at an old house that still seems to breathe a little bit with life, that isn't super old because it was built within the last couple of decades, and has history that's starting, new history that's starting. And you have Ivy, who's wearing, her full 1906 garb. She's got the corset, she's got the petticoats and things like that. So those are things that are great distinctions for the character that make her clearly historical. And then in the present, in the same vein as your historical lead, you're going to want distinctions about your present lead, along with elements that make the two characters collaborative in the story as a whole. So in other words, again, ask, can your characters be friends? If they weren't in two separate time periods, would they be able to be friends? And would they jive together? Because we do want them to be complementary, but again, we also want them to be distinct. So how do you take two characters and make them distinct? So if you look at The House on Foster Hill, I have Ivy and I have Kane. I did go, and I do often, and I actually have another workshop on this, on how to use personality assessments like the Myers-Briggs to create characters. If you're at all familiar with it, you'll understand where I'm going with this. If you're not familiar with it, a good place to go to is 16personalities.com. It will give you a brief overview of the Myers-Briggs personality types, and it's a tool that a lot of writers I know personally use to define their characters. I wanted Ivy and Kane to be very similar, so I gave them very similar personalities. Ivy is an INFP and Kane is an ENFP. So the main difference between the two of them is Ivy is introverted and Kane is extroverted, hence the I and the E. But the NFP means that they both are intuitive, they process through feelings, and they're very perceptive. And those things made them very complementary, not necessarily at odds. Now, you don't always have to make your characters the exact same personality type with just a difference of introversion or extroversion. You could give them dramatically different characteristics. I could have given Ivy a very critically thinking personality, one that was very analytical, one that was very sensory, one that was more of a judging personality that would judge versus perceive. And Kane could have been more of the feeler. She could have been more of the sensitive, creative type. But because of the story and because of what I was doing with this theme and what I was doing with the setting and that ultimate goal of hope, both of these characters really suited that more emotional, creative, feeler type of a personality. And that's why they received that in the story. But again, as you're picking the personality types of your character, this is again where that central theme of going back to what is the main thrust of the message of my story going to be. It will really help you define what the purpose of this character is and what their personality types should be. Ivy, as you can see, was far more internal. She was far more internally focused. She journaled. She kept a memory book of people who had passed on in her community. But she was also a female in medicine who was unwelcome. She was working with her father's medical practice. And in 1906, there wasn't necessarily, burgeoning with women in medicine at the time. And it was kind of a new territory. And so it was something that she was in and she was doing under the wing of her father because she was introverted. She wasn't necessarily going to bust out of her seams and make, a zealous push to be independent. And at the same time, she wanted that. And so that shows a little bit of her character and why she was the way she was based on her Myers-Briggs INFP personality. Then you have Kane. She was far more extroverted. She was a virtual assistant. She was very interactive with her clients. She was far more outgoing. She was into dog rescue, which takes her to the rescue shelter in the book. She's dating a therapist, and there's lots of talking, lots of external communication about how she's feeling and processing grief. That furthered the story far better to have her extroverted, because an extrovert will typically process their emotions verbally, where an introvert is going to process their emotions internally. And I wanted to show the difference between the two of them because they were both on that journey to find hope through grief, to find hope and a purpose for living. They were both on a journey to find out why Gabriella had died and what her purpose was. And I wanted to have a character that processed things very quietly and internally. And most people couldn't read her very well. But I also wanted another character that would lend toward the story and toward conversation. And so I made Kane an extrovert so that she would be almost verbally vomiting her feelings at times so that she could hear herself speak and then process those emotions. All right, for plot, this one is really fun. I love it because it keeps things pretty simple. There's foreshadowing, fruition, and resolution. There's 3 parts to a plot when I do a split time story. Foreshadowing, your past story will be setting all the foreshadowing for the future. So clues should be dropped, imagery should hint toward something, characters should begin the process of the plot, and what's to come futuristically. So basically, everything in the past storyline is a hint, it's a setup for the present storyline. It's a foreshadowing. It's the shadow that goes before the actual person. It's the story that goes before the actual story. The present day story is going to be one that brings the plot out of the shadow and into the light. This is where you're going to reveal the discovery. The imagery should revert toward the past and how it links to the current, and the characters should further the story. All right. So then in the resolution of that, that's the marriage of the 2 time periods, and that they will be most successful if you can take the reader on a journey that helps their imagination travel with the characters. That's really jarring for a reader to jump from different settings, dramatically different characters, dramatically different plots, when their brain hasn't connected those underlying commonalities that make it a complete story. So by doing the concept of foreshadowing and fruition, that helps lend toward that seamless transition from back and forth, back and forth, back and forth in the story. One would argue, if you're familiar with the Bible, a lot of people would argue that the Old Testament is a foreshadowing of what was to come in the New Testament. There was a point of each one being sectioned out differently because one was prophecy, shadowing things that were to come, and then the New Testament was the fruition of that story. And so that's what you also want to do in a split time story, is you want to set those clues to be solved in the present. So in The House on Foster Hill, we had the abandoned house, an unidentified murder victim, and the mysterious intents of the house. And I didn't want to put down all the spoilers as to what the fruition was, but we do have the solving of the purpose of the murder victim. We do have the exposing of what the intents of the house were really for. And we do have a culmination of the mystery that started in 1906 was then solved in the present day. That resolution is going to be really important. And that's something else that as you're working through your plot, as a writer, you're going to want to make sure that you're writing down everything that you put in the past as a clue or as a foreshadow, because every single loose end, every single foreshadow needs to be neatly tied up somehow in the fruition, which is the present day story. Those little threads are really critical and they really need to keep track of them. All right, so as we draw to a close, that is a very fast overview of what I consider the 4 parts of a split time story. It puts it into segments, perhaps adds a little bit of organization to it. Again, if you're a reader and you're just joining in to understand a little bit about how a split time is written, what you're seeing is a glimpse into my brain. Again, many writers write differently, and so this is not a one-size-fits-all process, but this is what I have found that has worked really well for me. I do recommend highly, again, going to 16personalities.com. That is going to really help you with learning about different characteristics and personality types that will help you make that definition between a past and a present character. And also, I really encourage you to look into the concept of building themes into your story. Themes to me are as critical as a plot If you don't have a theme, you don't necessarily have depth. And if you don't have depth, you don't necessarily have a drive for your characters. And so they all fit together and come together. And that's how I have so far figured out how to do it. And I'm still learning, still reading. I'm reading lots of other split time authors and finding other things that they do that they've done so phenomenally well and learning from them. So I will stop there and I'll stop sharing my screen and say thank you all for listening and open up for questions.
Great. Thank you. That was wonderful. We've got some questions coming in, so I will read them here. So we've got a question. Wait, let me grab this here from Jamie. What was the hardest part for you to keep track of for Ivy and Kane?
The hardest part was kind of what I was referring to at the end there with the little tiny hints and foreshadows that you put out. For example, in the book, Ivy has a memory quilt that she'd made out of pieces of her brother's clothing, which was not uncommon in the historical time period. And then in the present day story, Kane actually had that in her belongings, but she didn't necessarily know what it was. And so there were little allusions to it throughout the story, and I had to make sure each one of those tiny, tiny little details was tied up. So that I would say would probably be the most challenging part. And honestly, what I do is I have a journal right here. And as I'm writing, if I have a little hint that I drop, I just write down that hint in my journal so that at the end of the manuscript, I go back and make sure every single one of those hints have been answered in the present time.
Great. Okay, great. And then we've got this here from Elizabeth. She wrote, "Thank you for this insight. Do you recommend formal education in literature to become a writer or another path?"
I would say that any education you can get to become a writer is huge. Personally, I do not have a formal education in literature, but I will say that I have read voraciously since I was a child. I think the most important thing you can do to become a writer is read, and read not necessarily just what you enjoy reading. So I've always enjoyed, like when I was little, I loved Nancy Drew and Trixie Belden, and I've always loved mysteries, and et cetera, et cetera. But I have read everything from Where the Crawdads Sing to Ivanhoe, the old classic. I mean, that's not an easy book to slug through, but my goodness, or slug through. But it's so rich in how Sir Walter Scott writes and the things that you learn. And you also learn that you don't necessarily in modern day want to write 4 pages of room description. That will lose a reader. So I think as far as what I would recommend, any education you can get, whether it's formal or whether it's in your own home with books, is important. But first and foremost, you have to read. If you're not reading and you're not broadening your horizons with different types of writers and different styles and different voices, it's going to be really hard to understand how to put the written word together into a story.
Great, thank you. And then Denise asks, what drew you to writing in split time?
Honestly, it was accidental. I had signed with a publisher and was writing at the time it was a historical romance. And some things happened within the industry that were making sales a little bit difficult at the time. And a friend of mine who's also a published author said, maybe you should write a split time. And I didn't understand what she was talking about. I didn't know what it was. And when I looked up to find out what it was, it just completely, all the pieces for me fit together because I'd spent so much of my life in antique stores and going to historical museums and studying history. And, you know, I would pick up a teacup in an antique store and be like, oh, what stories could this teacup tell? You know, that they're just hidden in the porcelain and we'll never know whose fingerprints touched them. And split time for me is really taking those stories and taking them out of that article and then making it into a life and a story. And so once I found out that definition, I was hooked and I haven't really looked back, honestly.
Great. We got this one. Let's see. Quinn wrote, Jamie, thank you. This was an excellent presentation. So I wanted to share their comment. And then we have another question from Barbara. She wrote, I haven't yet read your books, but now I'm going to. She's excited. She's wondering what conventions you use to show when time changes between chapters.
sometimes what I will do, there's a couple different things I do. One of the things I'll do, and it sounds weird, but I'll repeat the sentence that I left off in the first sentence or in the last chapter. So for example, with Ivy, I might have something like, Ivy stared down the road and she wondered, what did the future hold? Flip to the next page. Cain stared into the mirror and wondered, what did the future hold? So you've got that community between the two, but two different names and slightly different things they're staring into, but yet it's a slow segue from one into another. And then another way of splitting into the two different times is, you might have Ivy ending with, she's falling off a horse or somebody's holding her by gunpoint or she fell down the stairs in the old house, and you leave it on a cliffhanger. She fell down the stairs and she looked up and saw him, period. Next chapter. Cain was making coffee the next morning, and it's like, what? And so I think you can segue differently. One can be jarring, but it can be jarring in an anticipatory way where, oh, now I need to get back to the old one, but wait, this one's interesting too. So it's kind of it's a struggle sometimes to find that balance. And I hope that answered the question.
I think so.
Okay.
Great. Thank you. I don't know if we have any other questions coming in. Let me just double check here. Right, I think we answered them all. It was great questions.
All right.
Well, thank you so much. That was wonderful. It was great to kind of see it all broken down so nicely and thought out. So it's very interesting.
It was fun to be here, and I really appreciate the time, and I appreciate this festival. It's so cool that you guys went virtual.
Thank you so much. We're really happy to have you here. And I hope we've got other events going on this week. So join us if you can. But yeah, thank you so much. Oh, wait, maybe we've got one more question here.
Okay.
We've got one more if we've got time. Denise
Sure.
asks, how long does it take you to write a book?
From start to finish, and when I say start, I mean actually starting to think about the plot, not necessarily sit down and writing. It usually takes me about 6 months to do it. I will typically sit down and start actually writing the book about 8 weeks, and I'll get it all written out in about 2 months. But I do a lot of it in my head. So when I sit down to start writing, it's usually pretty much written at that point. I'm just transposing from what's in my mind. So
Awesome. Well, great. Thank you.
mm-hmm.
Perfect. Thanks so much. Thanks everyone for joining us, and we hope to see you at other events throughout the week. Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye.